Well, it gives me great pleasure to sit here with you, Professor Emeritus Edwin Salpeter from Cornell University. Today is the 12th of November 2008, and we're here on a cold Ithaca November afternoon, but inside a warm house with a fire on. Could I ask you, Ed, first of all, would you tell me where and when you were born?
I was born in Vienna, Austria in 1924, but I spent much of my first 5 years in Budapest. That was a time when there was a lot of back and forth between Austria and Hungary. It wasn't any longer the Austro-Hungarian Empire quite, but my dad went to a job in Budapest for 5 years.
Do you have any memories of those early years back and forth?
No, not at all. A few years later, you know, when I was a pre-teenager, we went back to Hungary, and in a week I managed to pick up Hungarian words more quickly than other people. But no, I don't really have any memory from, well, maybe the one thing I accomplished is learning how to swim in a pool that went with my dad's firm.
What work was he doing that took him to Budapest?
Well, he very early, immediately after his PhD, he was very, university inclined, and even wrote a textbook called Mathematical Methods for Physicists and Medical Doctors. But it became fairly clear that there was just too much anti-Semitism for that. Especially he had a close friend from his own university's days, Erwin Schrödinger, who of course got a Nobel Prize soon after, and I had relatives who knew, and they advised my dad, "You're just not gonna make it in universities," but industries were much more open-minded and much less anti-Semitic.
I wonder why that was. Do you have any thoughts about that now in retrospect?
No, not at all, except I guess industry, worries most about making a good living, and the sociology was not so important.
You've already told me, though, you were born in the interwar period in Austria to a Jewish family with a professional father who had academic background as well, a PhD. What about your mother?
Well, she got a PhD in physics, but really gave up working, as soon as I was born, which was just a year and a half after they got married. And after I was born, she would give sort of lessons occasionally, but she didn't really, work fully.
What was the physics of the early 1920s in Austria? What research did your parents do for their doctorates?
It really varied quite a lot. My dad did something on, the early days of radioactivity, or at least how radioactivity affected, currents in what would otherwise be insulators. Whereas Schrödinger did something on highly isolated insulators, so my dad's radioactivity almost did some trouble to Schrödinger's experiments, but they managed to work it out.
What was Vienna like, as far as you can recall, in the interwar years? Was it a dynamic and lively place, or was there already a build-up of fear of what was coming from Germany?
There was a lot of build-up of fear of everything, not just of Germany. We happened to live in a house which was sort of opposite a workers, a big apartment house, workers' flats, and then kitty corner from a local gendarmerie or army thing. And it must be when I was about 12 years old that they had an actual civil war right across our corner. Of course, my mom trying to keep me away from the window, but that's not easy to do with a 11 or 12-year-old when there's a war going on. So no, I would say, at least for a Jew, it was not at all a pleasant place.
The Jewish community of which you were part, was it rather like one thinks of as many parts of Germany, where intellectual, educated Jews are very assimilated, thought of themselves first as Germans and secondarily as Jews?
Yes,
Or,
certainly.
yes. Can you tell me a little bit more about your memories of if there was a Jewish community when you were young and what it meant for you and your family?
In Austria, very little. I had a few boyfriends, and because of that great anti-Semitism, even at that stage, you had more friends of, your own persuasion. So it's more that my friends were mostly Jewish.
But already by the late 20s and early 30s, there were anti-Jewish measures in place to make your father's professional life difficult, and your schooling was also impacted, I think.
Well, the schooling, there's some controversy between my mother and me. Namely, when I was about 10 years old, when you finished elementary school, you had to make an exam to get into the gymnasium. The gymnasium is sort of, high school of all kinds, so you absolutely needed that to do anything else. And lo and behold, I flunked the entrance exam. Now, my mother said, well, it's just that the authorities are all anti-Semitic, and, you should have passed easily. My theory was that sure, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but I mainly flunked because I kept reading a Wild West story writer called Karl May, who wrote, for some reason, about the U.S. Wild West, but in German, for German boys. And of course, we'll never know which was the main story, and presumably it was a little bit of both.
What were your parents' names, Ed?
My dad's name was Jacob Leib, or Leib. It was sort of a custom that even if you were not a very religious Jew, that you would take on a Jewish middle name. And I think Leib or Leib is lion. My mom, on the other hand, had such a long first name, Friederike, that she didn't bother having a second.
Do you recall your mother's maiden name?
Horn, H-O-R-N.
And do you have any memories or stories about your grandparents on either side?
Well, my grandfather, my dad's parents and relatives I absolutely never met even. See, my dad had come from Galicia, which keeps changing from Romania to Poland to God knows what. and he left, for study in Vienna. But his Galician relatives didn't come to Vienna.
Do we know what happened to them, out of interest, during the war and
Yes,
after?
yes. We have a relative who died in the meantime, a bit older than me, who somehow kept up, and of course they were all murdered. In fact, many of them by just the local Poles who at that time were in charge of Galicia, and then of course the remainder by the Nazis. But as I say, I absolutely never had any knowledge of them.
And what about your mother's parents and her relatives, brothers and sisters?
Well, that was much easier because I lived in an apartment house which was owned jointly by my mother and her mother. My grandfather on that side, I never knew. He died either before I was born or at least before I could have remembered. So him I don't remember, but of course I remember stories about him. We even have a photograph of him proudly driving a car when my mother was 8 years old or so.
What stories do you recall? Was he a stern man or a warm and loving father to your mother?
I don't know those stories, but he was very proud. He was an electrical engineer, and he was sort of very proud of being assimilated. He once even, there was a tiger that had escaped from a traveling show, and he shot the tiger. So that was one of the big stories. But then also, my mother as a girl traveled a lot, because he, especially in summer times, he would go and build mostly electric railroads. I mean, that was his specialty. He was an electrical engineer in general, but that was his main thing, converting funiculars and other things into being run by electricity.
It's a great lineage from a maternal grandfather as electrical engineer, a mother, a physicist, yourself an astrophysicist.
Yes. So.
But I'm thinking back now to the early 1900s when your mother was probably born.
Yes,
to have
exactly.
a young Jewish woman to have a chance to do a PhD in physics, it has to be quite an enlightened and intellectually experimental family that would want that for their daughter anyway at the time.
Well, my mother really had wanted to study medicine, but the authorities at the university decided that there's money in medicine. You know, medicine is a useful and important area, so they absolutely would not let us study medicine. But physics seemed such a completely useless topic. They didn't mind at all. No, they liked having their lectures more full, so they didn't mind her doing that.
Can you tell me a little bit about your memories, any anecdotes you have about that period in Vienna up until, I think, your departure to Australia before the outbreak of war?
Well, not very much. I mean, for me personally, the most interesting thing was my attitude towards areas of endeavor and school, etc. We had lived in a very non-intellectual suburb, and I was in a school that wasn't in any way, selected. And so I was sort of the top of my class in, all the subjects they did. But I wasn't in any way, interested in the future, so to speak, what I would want to do when I grew up and how I should make decisions of that kind. Not at all.
Aside from yourself, were there other children? Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have a half-sister. My dad, before he married my mother, had married this Catholic woman, and with the intention of getting divorced immediately after, because he got her pregnant before they got married. But he went to a lot of trouble, which in a way is slightly surprising. He became a Catholic just for the marriage, so it could be able to say that father and mother were both Catholics. And then my sister was given a very Christian and Catholic first names, Maria Christina. And that was partly because her mother already felt that, they might have to pretend that she was, fully non-Jewish. And also then, when the war happened, they emigrated from, my sister and her mother, from Vienna to Feldkirch, which is a little town in at the border between Austria, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, just so they, should be away from any people who might have known. Somebody in Vienna might have known my mother and my father, and might have remembered that my dad was Jewish. So they did that.
And they survived the war? They survived the war?
They survived the war, and even, my sister's mother survived to quite a high age, and although they could by that time have moved back to Vienna, they stayed all the time in Feldkirch. And in fact my sister, well, she married a Swiss businessman, but he didn't mind living in Feldkirch either. So all three of them, stayed in Feldkirch.
And she shares your last name, Salpeter?
Yes, yes.
Which means what, out of interest?
Well, just potassium nitrate in German, and saltpeter is is the equivalent thing.
So I think perhaps the reason that all your family became physicists was to escape the chemistry in your
It
name.
could well be, yes, yes. It turns out when I was in college in Sydney, I got very interested in chemistry, and I almost switched my major from physics to chemistry, but not quite. I switched back. But I've had almost as many papers published in chemical journals than in physics ones.
So essentially you grew up as an only child with a
Essentially
half-sister.
a group. I mean, we would meet meet typically every second Sunday somewhere. Have dinner at some mountain resort
And did your parents never think of having more children, or was it also with the build-up of tensions and hostilities, it wasn't prudent to have a second child?
Well, things were pretty bad after all. Austria and then the war, and for a while it looked as though the Japanese might invade Australia, etc. So no, they really never ever thought of one more child.
So at a certain point, your family and you left Vienna and moved to Australia. Do you recall when that was? And can you tell me a little bit about the steps of that move, of your exile in a way?
Yes, I should go back a little more to my dad when he went into industry. He very soon specialized in running incandescent lamp factories. And but outside this, there was a big cartel run mainly by Philips Electrical Industries, but he started with one of the outsider firms. So of course he had, patent fights and so on. So that was, what he did for a living. And then when we were trying to get out of Austria, Germany, at first, of course, he was the usual Jew of saying that wouldn't happen here in this country of Beethoven and Mozart. But after Kristallnacht, which was just a few days ago this month, although it's interesting, different people seem to differ as to exactly which day in November it was. But anyway, after that, he started getting interested in finding a job somewhere and emigrating. So I'm always likely to say that Kristallnacht saved my life. So at any rate, luckily for him, there was in Sydney a manufacturer of glass, including the glass for light bulbs. And he used to sell light bulbs to the cartel, to Philips and Co. But they claimed his light bulbs were getting too expensive, so they threatened to make their own full light bulbs. So they needed somebody to be the boss of that light bulb factory, and my dad was clearly the kind of guy. So he got a job there already maybe in principle in December, but he had to, much of the raw materials, etc., weren't there in Australia. So we had to go via London. I've forgotten just when. He went a little bit earlier. My mother and I went in about January.
Of which year?
What? 39.
39.
Mm-hmm. And then Kristallnacht itself was 1938. And then I think in early January, my mother and I, also came on to London. And then we stayed, about two months or so. And so when I was in Australia growing up, I still didn't know much English, but it all had an English accent, not an Australian accent for a while.
Because of those two formative months
yes.
en route in London.
Yes. And part of that, somehow, I was even in a boarding school.
For those 2 months?
No, just only a few weeks.
Was there ever any chance that your father instead would have ended up in the States or in the UK or perhaps even in Holland, which at that point hadn't been occupied, and that's where Philips was based?
Well, certainly not the USA, because you Yanks were very, anti-refugees and anti-immigration. So there was no way to get a visa to the USA. Clearly, for a while, consider very peculiar sounding places like Ploiești in Romania. So, he had to look at almost any country that might possibly give him a job.
With your move via London to Australia, did you sever your ties with Vienna at the time? Did you just each have one suitcase you could bring, or did you make more of a formal move and take as many belongings as you could with you? What kind of move was it?
Well, it was a complicated sort of double play. When we were, well, first my mother and I, after Kristallnacht, were kicked out of our apartment with just one suitcase each, and then also for leaving Austria, all we could take with us was one suitcase each. But my mother managed to, get together some of the more important things in the house and hire an Austrian or German, shipping contractor to send it on to Sydney. And these things take a long time. And sure enough, that whole big, enormous crate, now paid for by the German shipping company, arrived in Sydney after the war had started. So on some levels, they're very thorough.
Very correct.
But
your goods weren't immediately interned in a refugee camp for coming from enemy territory? Your belongings were let to you, they were given to you, they weren't taken by the authorities?
Yes, interestingly enough, that they didn't mind at all.
What of your grandmother, your mother's mother, who was living with you also in that apartment?
Oh, not the apartment, the apartment house.
The house, yes.
She had her own, yes.
What happened to her when you were evicted?
She was sent to Theresienstadt and, murdered there.
So you arrived in Austria in the new year of 1939.
In Australia.
To what kind of country was it? How did it feel on arrival?
Well, for
you were 15-year-old.
For a teenager, it was just an ideal country to grow up in each of many, many different ways. So it was just, an outdoor country, so you could spend your time what they call bushwalking, hiking in the wilderness or the Blue Mountains.
Was the education system very different, and did it take you some time to adjust to that, and also studying in a new language, English?
Well, that's the new language actually led to my getting through quicker. Namely, the timing of high school years was different. And somehow it looked to the authorities as though they should put me into 4th grade or something, even though in fact I had been only in sort of the equivalent of 2nd grade. But they couldn't give me, tests on the subject matter because I knew almost no English yet, in spite of the British accent with what little I did know. They could give me intelligence tests, and obviously I was fairly smart. So they just let me, study on my own for a year or so. And sure enough, I managed to learn enough to get on.
Was Australian society there at the start of war a welcoming place for a European refugee, and the school also?
Yes, mostly quite. The school certainly, very much so. Most Australians also, yes.
Did your parents feel at home there?
Well, maybe not as much as I felt at home, but yes, I think they felt pretty much at home.
One thing that I've heard from people who've, particularly in the war, been uprooted and unsettled, is that when you move to a new country, you don't know whether to settle down and put your roots in. Did your parents think that this was going to be the permanent move where they would stay? Or do you think they already thought, this could be a country for a while, but we may move on?
No, I think it was pretty clear that it would be forever. As I say, my dad had a nice industrial base, although in fact it turned out for some reason that quite a few years later he switched from this to working for Philips itself. So he changed some. But at any rate, they were settled enough also. It was quite clear that,
it's easier,
Australia
of course,
would
for a teenager who's excited by all the
Yes.
open space and possibility. But for your parents, it must have been a bit more difficult.
Yes, it was certainly more difficult.
And did they quickly build a community of maybe other refugees, or a Jewish community, or other people with similar interests and professional backgrounds?
Yeah, refugees, not necessarily just Jewish ones, but refugees, yes.
One of the things one hears a lot about in that interwar period is not only of assimilated Jews, but also of kind of, how to put it, hopeful socialism. The left-leaning intellectuals of the interwar periods, and lots of publications and art and creativity. Were your parents in any way political or politically engaged with the leftist movements?
I would say very, very little. I was a little. There were the beginnings of sort of student societies. And I was a member of a couple that were slightly socialist, but thank God not communist. So I was the one who was more inclined that way.
And in your school years in Australia, aside from studying very hard and probably doing very well, did you have other hobbies and interests that kept you active?
Well, mostly bushwalking. I was one of the founding members of the Sydney University Bushwalking Club. So that took a lot of time, but also a bit of tennis and swimming.
And through your schooling and then into university, where did you study at university for your undergraduate?
Well, at that time there was just one university in Sydney, so I had no dilemma, no choice.
Was it clear already what your interests were and which direction you were hoping to go in?
Yes, I never quite finished the story about the high school in Vienna.
Please.
As I say, before Hitler, I was the top of my class in this suburb school, but then in September 38, there was just one Jewish school, so that maybe only 10, 20, or 20% of all the Jewish children were able to go to that school. And, you know, it was just academically selected. And so I found suddenly that I was no longer the top of the class in all subjects, and also some of the kids who beat me in history or English were girls and never been in a school together with girls. So that was all a very strange experience. But that time, although, you know, life was pretty tough, I mean, I put the probability of surviving to become an adult reasonably low. And that's just when I started thinking of what I would do, you know, if and when I did become an adult.
How much guidance, encouragement, support did you receive from your parents in this as well?
Well, some, but since mostly, you know, what I thought of fitted in quite well with what they were thinking. You know, it's usually when you're having slight fights with your parents that the conversations are longer. So there was some, but not very much.
And did your mother also work in Australia now that you were in full-time school?
No. She would sort of do, you know, tutorials, but she didn't really work.
Do you think she had professional regrets in that field, that she would have liked to go further with her academic research and scholarship?
Very hard to tell. Very hard to tell. She was not all that academically minded. It's strange that, you know, she went to that great difficulty and trouble of getting a PhD without, you know, being that interested.
So then, through your years at high school in Australia, and then into Sydney University,
Mm-hmm.
What did you choose to study at university?
Well, as I said, when I found that I was not the top of the class in subjects except math and science, you know, I decided one of those is what I should go into, and physics is what I happen to like best of these various subjects, quite apart from it, you know, being also what my parents did.
What was the physics department, or who was the physics professor at Sydney at the time?
It was a somewhat mixed thing. Many of them were a little bit stodgy, but some were really very good. There was one guy called Victor Bailey, who really did important research in electricity and gases, what would now be called plasma physics. So he was very good, and one or two of the other non-professors also were. So it was a good place in general.
Had the ranks of the faculty of the university in Australia also become broader and larger with emigres from Europe, or was it a pretty Anglo and Australian teaching faculty?
Well, the 4 years I was at the university, there weren't yet many, ex-European professors. There were later on, but not at that time.
it must be hard to look back if I ask you this question now, but is there a moment when you can pinpoint a nascent interest in astronomy?
Yes, but that's a fairly complicated story. There was a guy at Caltech, at the Kellogg Radiation Lab, a nuclear experimentalist, Willie Fowler, who was himself, just an experimentalist, but he knew he wanted to build up an interest in nuclear astrophysics. So he invited me to come for a summer in 1951. And at that time, I didn't know about nuclear astrophysics, but of course nuclear physics is one of the things I was a little bit of an expert in. But then when I came to Caltech, Willie Fowler, told me of sort of an important topic, namely how you go from helium nuclei to heavier nuclei in evolved stars. You certainly can't in main sequence stars because they're only about 10 million degrees in the center, but maybe something else will do it. So it soon became clear that red giant stars, although their surfaces are pretty low temperature because they have a very large radius, have quite hot interiors. At that time, one didn't know yet too much about the structure of stars, but qualitatively we knew that was it. And then also, clearly the way to go from helium to heavier elements would be to first go to carbon. That's helium-4 to carbon-12. Just 3 of those together would do that. But the question was, in detail, how do you do it? And having a triple collision is just not very easy. But luckily, I already knew that the in-between thing, beryllium-8, which would be 2 helium nuclei instead of the 3 in carbon, isn't stable. That's why you needed, to do the triple alpha eventually. But it turned out that it was almost stable. That, you needed some energy to go from 2 heliums to this resonant state in beryllium-8, which would then decay back again. So at any rate, there was this equilibrium, and then you can easily add another alpha particle to the beryllium-8. So that was a very easy way to get a lot of energy out of that reaction. I then made some goofs in that later on as well, but unless you're interested in Fred Hoyle, I won't go into that.
Well, thank you. I think I fast-forwarded you, and now I'm going to have to rewind you a little.
Yeah, very good.
Back to Sydney University. I think you excelled in your studies there, and I know that you went abroad for a PhD.
Yes.
Did you, before we get to the PhD, did you actually do a master's or something further like that, or did you jump straight?
No, I did a master's at that time, at the end of my undergraduate work in Sydney. For some reason, I got interested in quantum electrodynamics, which actually there wasn't much work on in Australia, but it was a red hot topic in England and the USA. So what I did for a master's degree is sort of just a pedagogical, summary review, almost little book on that. And that managed to get me a fellowship given by the Commission for the Exhibition of 1851.
A very prestigious fellowship.
What?
A very prestigious
A
fellowship.
very prestigious fellowship indeed, yes.
Which you could take wherever you wanted to.
You could take at least anywhere where you wanted in England, but that's what I wanted to do anyway.
It was clear that England was the place, and not the United States, and not further in Australia.
Somehow for a PhD, it seemed, pretty clear that you had to do it in England. After that, you could go to other places, but somehow, there was no dilemma. It might also be that this Commission for the Exhibition of 1851 was only for graduate schools in England. But I then had my first big dilemma. Namely, I could have gone to Cambridge, where Pierre Dirac was. And of course, that's a much more prestigious place than a red brick university. But the few people who really knew advised me already correctly that although Dirac is a great guy and is good at answering questions, etc., he would be a lousy thesis advisor. And that at that time, the best graduate school in theoretical physics in general was Rudy Pile's in Birmingham, even though Birmingham was a red brick university. And so I'm glad that in spite of the many voices the other way, I listened to the few voices who said I should go to Rudy Pile's, and I did, and sure enough, he was indeed the best leader of a graduate school.
What were Oxford and the universities in London doing in theoretical physics at that time?
Well, I mean, they were somewhat similar to Cambridge, not quite as prestigious because they didn't have Pierre Dirac. Dirac is clearly an extraordinary guy.
You got to know him later, I presume.
I got to know him while I was still a graduate student in Birmingham. While I was a student in Birmingham, I would make pilgrimages to Cambridge a fair bit and would ask him occasionally questions. But also I became friendly at that time with the three people who invented what is called the steady state cosmology: Fred Hoyle, Herman Bondi, and Tommy Gold. So I knew those already, before I had gotten my PhD.
And your decision to go to Birmingham and to be part of that very exciting time in physics, it was vindicated, you felt, despite your trips to Cambridge where you would meet world-famous physicists. You think that Birmingham was the right decision?
Oh, definitely, yes. Really, it's very different to have the right guy for to be a thesis advisor on the one hand versus just excellent people, whom you ask questions. And there's no doubt that, Rudy Piles was by far the best.
Can you tell me a little about Rudy Piles? What was he like? I think I've read that you actually some students lived together with him and his wife.
Yes,
in a boarding house.
he had a fairly big house, so after the first year, I actually lived with him. So Zhenya Piles, the daughter of a Russian general, his wife, was also my landlady.
And the mother of the department, in a
And
certain
the
way.
mother of the department, yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about Rudy or Rudolf? What was he like to work with? How did he work with his students? And what made it so stimulating?
Well, Piles was especially great for somebody like me who wanted to be a generalist, because he worked on many, many different fields inside theoretical physics. Of course, quantum electrodynamics, which I was doing, but also statistical physics, solid state physics, many, many others. And so each graduate student, had not just a different topic, but many of them in these different areas.
He also, if I recall rightly, grew up in a Jewish family in Germany. And escaped
Yes,
pre-war.
that's correct.
Do you remember? Did you speak German with him ever, or
No,
English?
No, not at all. Well, occasionally a German proverb or something would crop up, but not speaking German. No.
What makes a great supervisor in your mind? What did he do that was so
It's
successful?
very hard to tell. One of the things is I say it helps for him to work in many different fields, at least if you're inclined that way. But the more important thing maybe is that in each field, if you've already decided on one, like quantum electrodynamics, he had a number of different specific topics, and you could choose which one. But I guess the most important thing is that a really good thesis advisor knows how to draw the line between giving you detailed advice on the one hand and letting you work on your own with just an occasional remark on the other. And Piles really did that very well.
He received many honors. He was later knighted,
Yes,
although the Nobel evaded him.
yes.
He was also involved in the Manhattan Project, I think.
He was involved in the Manhattan Project. Not just that, but he arranged for Klaus Fuchs to also join the Manhattan Project. And Klaus Fuchs was, found to be a spy just while I was still with the Pileses in Birmingham. So that was a very, very big shock.
Sure. In how many years did you take to finish your PhD?
In what?
In how many years did it take you to complete your PhD?
Well, it's not quite clear if it was 2 years or 3, in the sense that I had it finished in 2 years, but I wanted to stay 1 more year in Birmingham anyway. So I think I actually took it, after 2.5 years. But of course, in the English system, unlike here, you specialize more as an undergraduate, so you do your PhD work much faster.
Yes. So that meant, I suppose, the idea of graduate courses, there wasn't much of that. You were under the supervision.
There wasn't much of that, or at least it didn't mean much to you. It's a pity, because there were some quite good mathematics teachers in Birmingham. whose courses I could have gone to, and I really didn't do that much.
We'll stop for a break in a minute. Just a couple of little questions, if I may, before we do, pre-break questions. Firstly, what was the title of your dissertation and what did you write about?
Interestingly enough, I don't even remember the title, and furthermore, I didn't even put it in my references in my autobiography. And that was not that it was wrong, it had to do with the self-energy of the electron, which I took seriously, but started with a finite radius for the electron and then went to zero and did that all very rigorously. And I did that okay, but what I didn't do and should have done and was done by other people is what is called renormalization theory. That what you're really interested in is how a free electron differs from an electron in an atom. And in particular, there was, just after I did my thesis, the experimental discovery of what is called the Lamb shift, showing that two levels which, according to the Dirac theory, should have the same energy have slightly different ones. And as I say, my thesis topic was such that I could easily have invented that, and I didn't. I just didn't think of it.
Was it a topic that you chose, or was it very much under the guidance of your professor, really?
No, it's one I chose. At that time, I thought, doing rigorous things were important or elegant or something. So yes, I had chosen it. I mean, Pyle suggested it amongst other quantum electrodynamics things, but yes, I chose it.
Thank you. Let's take a little break.
Good.